Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to Beyond Wellbeing Live, Camwell's monthly series where we explore the future of work through the lens of well-being, culture, and human sustainability. I'm Kirsten Samuel, CEO and founder of Camwell, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's session, The Future of High-Performing Teams, Unlocking Sustainable Success. Now, high-performing teams are often seen as the engine of business growth. But in today's evolving workplace, what really sustains that performance over time? And how do we lead teams that operate at a high level and stay healthy, motivated, and resilient along the way? I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic guests today, all very passionate about this topic to help us unpack it. We've got Dean Curtis, CEO of Data Services at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, where he leads global teams delivering powerful data and analytics to help organizations manage risk and make better decisions. We've got Steve Huber, SVP at Salesforce, a company known not just for its results, but for its exceptional culture. And Simon Shepherd, founder of Optima Life and best-selling author and speaker with deep expertise in both team and human performance and well-being. So a big thanks to all of you for joining. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So Dean, if I may, I'd love to start with you, but just firstly, before we dive in, how are you today?
Okay, in terms of sustainable performance, I've had a tough few weeks. The year started quite well for me. I started to get into some things I'd been meaning to do for some time, writing a book and all sorts of different things. And then work changed about a month ago, so I've been doing some longer days and spending a bit more attention managing my energy levels. Let's put it that way. But no, I'm good today. Looking forward to it.
So this is a good topic then. And perhaps you could just start by giving us a quick snapshot of the scale of your operations and business at LexisNexis, whether that's number of people, teams, geographies, just to help ground us in your world a bit.
Yeah, so LexisNexis Risk Solutions, we're one of four divisions of RELX, which is currently a FTSE 10 company, fifth in the FTSE. We have about 37,000 staff in risk. We have 11,000 staff, I think, in 53 countries. We basically provide data and analytics, decision-making tools to business professionals. So we work with many other organisations. So that's kind of the scale. Directly in my organisation, I have just over about 2,000 people.
Fantastic, thanks. That's helpful context, Dean. And obviously there's a lot of complexity in what you lead. So with that as a kind of starting backdrop, many people still equate high performance with doing more faster. From your perspective, how do we go about shifting that mindset from more work to better work?
Yeah, how we continue to zoom out and remind ourselves of that, I think, is really important, because when we chase daily life, it's very easy to get caught on that hamster wheel of what you've just outlined. So I guess there's a few things. I mean, high performance is actually getting the same results more efficiently as well. That is extreme high performance. And in a world of chaos now, I do think that for us as leaders, even providing clarity, vision and focus becomes really important, so that people can really be clear about what matters in the business world, so they can equate that to their wider lives, which of course is important in that equation. We've got to give ourselves to everything, and the world is full of chaos and vulnerability at the moment. I call it a polycrisis. There's lots of things happening together. You've got the economic, the political turbulence, there's lots of technological and social change too. And all of those things together can be quite overwhelming. We went through a period of reasonable stability for quite a long period, but since COVID, we've had this chaos everywhere. And I think that has meant that we all find it harder to really look through that chaos to say what does matter. And in times like that, I'm a big believer in simplicity and simplifying things further, and ensuring that focus is there so that we all agree on what we can really focus on. And that then becomes the basis of, well, what does my work mean, and what contributes to that? And for a number of years now, an old boss 20 years ago said to me, I often make a habit of going back and looking at my calendar a year ago. How did I spend my time, and which of the meetings really made a difference? And sometimes that backward view can help you in terms of best using the time. But it's not about busy work. But it's about doing the work that matters. But in that work that matters, discretionary effort is important too.
That's really interesting. And are there specific things that you've put in place within your organisation to help embed that mindset? What's worked really well for you in practice?
Yeah, so we do a number of things. So I'm slightly unique. I have a bit of a background in sport. So I have a head of performance. That head of performance reports directly to me. We have performance analysts and psychologists in the business every single day. And we train people on what high performance is, and the adjective or verb or whatever you want to put in front of high performance becomes important. And this is sustainable high performance. And I think all high performance is sustainable, because by very definition, that's what the best is. Otherwise, it's just a moment, and it's quite hard to be sustainable. So we do a number of things. We work on something called Red to Blue, which is mindset as a trainable skill. And we also have something called the performance pie of the pieces that kind of fit within someone's personal performance. So we manage that. And in a vulnerable world, we can all work on being the best version of us. And the element of control and fulfillment that comes with that is quite important. We'll probably touch on those maybe a bit later, but I'll just finish by saying, and to be serious about it, we have something called Pause for Performance. So on a Wednesday between 9 and 11, there are no meetings, and people work on their own development plan and their own performance recipe. High performance, I believe, is unique to each individual. My version of high performance at ice skating is not a high bar of high performance, right? But I'm better at other things. So we have our unique summits, and therefore we have our unique performance recipes to achieve our own potential, and recognizing that's different in everyone. So everyone has their own development plan. And on a Wednesday morning, we create the time for people to really focus on themselves and their development plan. As I said, people need different things. Some people work too hard, probably, and they might do yoga or go for a walk in nature, and others might learn more technical knowledge about what we do as an organization, whatever that may be.
That's so interesting. You're quite unique in the respect of having your own head of performance, your own psychologist, and actually dedicating that time to performance rather than well-being and other things. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. And I say, well, the saying we have is performance is doing the things you need to do to get the results you want. And coming from a sporting world, the worst thing you can do is tell somebody to win, right? And it's like telling a child to pass an exam or somebody not to worry. It's not useful information. But in business, it's okay to say, make sure you hit your target. We're very much focused on the performance input to the outcomes that we want to achieve. I get judged on results. Sole focus on that doesn't help, and it's the same for each individual, because in times of challenge and vulnerability and stress and chaos, that outcome can sometimes feel overwhelming. But if we focus on just being better today than we were yesterday, individually and collectively, all of a sudden the tide starts to rise, and that's when better things happen.
Those 1% marginal gains, isn't it?
Exactly that.
Thank you, Dean. So Steve, let's bring you in next. How are things going at Salesforce right now?
Yeah, really well, thank you. So I've been at Salesforce for 7 years now, and I think in the context of creating high performing teams, it's a subject that's really close to my heart, and it's something which I'm very passionate about, developing sustainable high performing teams. And I think it's something where teams can go again with enthusiasm month after month, and being very deliberate about creating those. And I think in the 7 years I've been at Salesforce, we've grown from being roughly 34,000 people globally to 75,000 people. So one of the things that comes with that level of growth and that level of expectation is that if you're going to be deliberate about culture, and there's no exact science to this, but if you're going to be deliberate about culture, you have to have a plan, and it has to be something that will scale and grow with the sort of headcount growth of a business. And just hearing some of the points Dean was making there, I think some of the things I loved about your comments, Dean, was that the points you made were deliberate, but they're also very simple. And I think that's certainly something I try and instill in my teams, that if we're going to do something, it needs to be deliberate, it needs to be simple, easy to understand, things that people can get behind, and something you can be consistent with quarter over quarter, year over year, so that the people understand where the expectation is. And then as you start to build leadership teams out around you, they can understand, they can understand what high performance looks like in the business. And again, certainly when you were saying about the results point there, ultimately results is what we're judged on, but that's very much a lagging indicator. And you can control lots of the inputs, lots of the leading indicators to performance and results, but ultimately you can't control the result. So I think if we can zero in on what those leading indicators look like and do things well and keep it simple, then that's most likely to transition into high performance in whatever your business area is.
Thank you. And Simon, Dean and Steve have obviously talked about how high performance can show up in action and why it's important, but you've obviously seen it play out in very different contexts too, be that across elite sport, the NHS, a wide range of corporate environments that you've worked with. From your perspective, what are some of the often overlooked ingredients that truly power high performing teams?
So thanks, Kirsten. I mean, I'm a department of one, by the way, so I feel slightly sort of overwhelmed with all these people who employ all these so many things. But I am very privileged. I go into lots of different settings and see lots of things. So yeah, just on that, and I think again, I totally agree. We focus on the output so often. We focus on the result so often, and it isn't just at work. A lot of people did the London Marathon a couple of weeks ago, and their friends will ask them, how did you do? And they'll go 3 hours, 57.46.
So true.
Or how did the A-levels go for little Johnny? 2 A's and a B. And they don't think actually to get the 3 hours, 57, that person's done 50 to 55,000 strides. They don't think of all the work they do beforehand and laying down the foundation stones and training. And they don't think of little Johnny. Actually, what I did was I wrote 6 well-reasoned paragraphs in my history exam. But it's almost our human natures to jump to the output. So I can see why businesses and people and organization automatically go there. And I wonder if one of the first things we've got to do is rewire our brain a little bit so that we're talking about inputs in many aspects of our lives, not just the output. But in terms of the key things, it was interesting. We went to 1% marginal gains. I tell you what, I'm not sure I've been into many businesses where they've got the foundation stones right. There are a few people, definitely a few people who, yes, we will go to the 1%ers. But I would say for 90% of the business, you're still working on the basic foundation stones. And yeah.
What are they, Simon?
Well, for me, it's really simple things, sleep well, stay energized. And I quite like what's known as the performance equation, which reads high performance is your knowledge, your mindset, your skills, minus the interferences, multiplied by energy. Now, energy is the multiplier. So, if energy is 0, it doesn't matter how clever you are and what skills you've got, what else is going on, performance is going to be 0. So the starting point for me is energy. So that comes from good relationships with yourself and other people, good sleep, good nutrition, good exercise, and a sense of feeling content in what you are doing at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think what you've just said really raises a big question, which is actually how do we define success in the first place? Because in many organizations, it is still measured on a dashboard, but, as we're discussing today, it's certainly not the whole picture. So how do you help teams define what success really looks like beyond just output and metrics? Where do you start? Does anyone get any thoughts on this one?
So I'll happily jump in there. I think something that I started about 5 or 6 years ago with my teams was really in order to keep things very simple for everyone that works for me. It's being very deliberate about the priorities that I have, and I have 3 priorities. And again, back to keeping it very simple. So my priorities for all of my team is health, family, work. And if you chat to any of my teams, any of the roles, and you ask them what are the priorities, they kind of get it now, because over many years I've proved that this is my priority set, and I expect them to live by these. And the idea and the rationale behind it is that if people have, and I think especially in a sort of hybrid world where people are often balancing, perhaps work from home and sometimes in the office and lots of other life things that have gone on, certainly in a post-pandemic world. If they've got distractions around health or family, that detracts them from work. Now, we all know we've had kind of calls where people are logged in, but the camera's off, and they're not really paying attention, but they're kind of, they're sort of, they're notionally being there or logged into the meetings that are in their calendar. By having the health, family, work as a priority set, all of my team know that if there's anything that comes up to do with health or family, I kind of pre-authorized prioritize that, give 100% focus there. Back to your be where your feet are, Dean. It's very much aligned to that. I'm gonna nick that as a as a statement, because it kind of aligns perfectly to this. And I think this is something where then the amount of time I have left when they're working, ideally that's a full week. So ideally if they're working 40 hours a week, ideally that's 40 hours. But if it's 35 hours because they've had 5 hours of stuff that's related to health or family that they need to prioritize in the moment, that means that they gave their full self to sorting those issues out. But when I have them from work, they're fully motivated, fully engaged, doing their best work, and we're giving them their best chance to be successful. And I think some of the feedback I've had in the past is, what if people abuse that? What if people see that as a free pass, just not to be present? Well, it's in a high performing culture, generally, if you hired right, people won't abuse that. And actually, if that's the first thing in an environment they start to abuse, that's also a great way of sifting out where you've hired the wrong person. If they think that's something to abuse, there's probably other things that aren't going to work well with that employment situation. So I think it's a great way of building trust and really differentiating with your team, from my team, what we're about, what our values are. And I think I found that leads to much higher levels of staff satisfaction, lower levels of staff attrition, all the things that then mechanically add to the performance of the team, which ultimately is what we're going to get judged on. So none of these things, I think anybody that thinks focusing on well-being matters is a detractor to performance, I think they're confused. It's focusing on these things in the right way is very much additive to delivering the results that our businesses want from us.
It's a good set of priorities there, Steve. And Dean, I can see you smiling. Are you in agreement there?
1,000,000%. Yeah. I mean, I struggled a lot with the word balance in my life. And weirdly, it was during COVID, probably way too late, where I was on form in COVID. Like, I'd read a lot. The first day I would normally have presented like this. I purposely had a kind of zipped up quarter zip sports top on, and I was talking to the staff and said, look, this is your kid's home before it's your office. How we work to get through this is important. I ran business continuity for our business, so that was, as I said, 116 offices, 54 countries, stuff going on everywhere. Lockdown became a bit of a blessing in that part of the role, to be honest with you. And I was running in the morning, looking after my nan and neighbour, dropping shopping off. I spent more time with my kids. We went out walking. If you measured yourself on performance, I was probably at my best for that period of time. But I still didn't feel good enough. I'm looking on social media and seeing people baking banana bread and doing yoga, and that perception that the world gives us, right? And even at that time, when I believe I was at my best from a performance level, I still felt inadequate because I felt I should have been doing other stuff. So to Steve's point, I have a saying, be where your feet are, particularly with parents and people with other carers and whatever outside of work. You can feel that you're not good enough at work and you should be spending more time. And likewise, if you're spending time at work, you feel, I should be with my family. So the phrase I try and use with the staff is be where your feet are, right? Because, I don't want people checking emails when they're having dinner with their family. And at the same time, when you're at work and you're doing something important, you need to be focused on that too. So that's where that really comes from.
Can I just add something in there, Kirsten? Because I think the C word has been mentioned, hasn't it, in terms of culture? And we all go on how important culture is, and just from my world of sport and now within other organisations, I think the really, really high performing teams are happy to have conversations about what I call the anti-culture. That for me is another level up. If you can have the conversation around what really gets under your skin about the people around you as a collective, you need to have that psychologically safe place. But anti-culture, I think, is actually a bit of a differentiator between an average team and a really, really good team. They're prepared to look at both sides of the coin, the ambition, but actually the tripwires as well.
And how many organisations that you spend time with, Simon, are open to having those conversations and really looking deep under the covers of what's going on?
Unfortunately, if I'm there, they've probably got no choice. So it's probably nearly all of them. But typically, I would say no one's really done it before.
Yeah.
Everyone has this sort of dream about trusting everyone and all of these sort of buzzwords that are really, really important. But actually, let's have a little chat about what gets under your skin, whether it's cynicism, whether it's gossip, whether it's being unappreciated.
From leadership, I think it's actually quite good to turn it around. So a lot of people spend a lot of time on what are shared values, but it's just as important to know what you're not. And sometimes I've had teams struggle with, what does success look like for us in 3, 5 or 10 years? It's amazing sometimes how some groups actually do a better piece of work if you ask them what failure is, because then they'll begin to give you the answers of the things that you need to do.
Really interesting.
I also think I think around the topic of culture, I think it's an easily banded around term. I know that there was so I'm a great fan of kind of continual learning. All of my teams roll their eyes when they hear me mention UC Berkeley again. I've been going to the Haas Business School every year for the last 9 years, and I took a course a year ago, and it came at a good time as I was starting a new role at Salesforce, building a new team, and the course was led by the dean of Haas Business School, and it was delivering strategy through culture. Perfect course, just the right time for me. And I remember there was a moment when the professor sort of asked the group generally, it's like, how do you find out what's going on in your organizations? How do you actually sort of have that feedback loop? And I remember being sort of sat there. I think I've got this. This is excellent. It's I sit in an open office. It's I don't bury myself away. I purposely go out on the floor and sit in amongst things and only take myself away from meetings. I'm very accessible on all of this. And the press sort of ticked me off, and she was like, but when do you actually ask? It was a pretty simple question. It was like, okay, that's a really good question. So literally from coming back, one of the things that I do now with my leaders is instigate quarterly listening sessions where everybody that works for us, hundreds of people, we will sit down in groups of 10 and we will spend 45 minutes every quarter and we will prioritize this. And I think what we've realized is that everybody that works with us in our teams, that they're the owners of our performance, and they're the owners of the culture that we're looking to develop. So having that kind of empowerment that this is everybody's responsibility, and the thing that amazes me every single time we have one of these sessions is that 18 months into doing this, nobody has come to me in one of those sessions with we need to do more of X because that helps me. Every single idea is about, we need to do more of X because that will help the team, that will help the group. It's always about the collective, and I think that level of ownership has really helped us underpin them being very deliberate about having building blocks of culture that will differentiate us and make us successful. But I think there's it's often, I think in a fast-paced business, people say we've got a great culture because I don't know, we have a social once a month, so it's fine. We've got a culture. It's all good. The team love each other, and it's all good. But I think actually, as leaders of an organisation, that you need to take that. You need to step off the treadmill and find a way of being deliberate and actually being able to write something down. And if it's too hard to write down, you probably haven't got a culture, or it's probably too complicated that nobody's going to be able to articulate it. If you can write it down simply on one piece of paper, that's probably something that will sustain, it will endure, people will buy into, and also is something that can then be refined by all those that you want to exist within that culture to deliver high performance.
Yeah.
I think that comes back to exactly what you said at the start, Dean, around having that clarity, setting that clarity, that vision, that focus, and making it as simple as possible for people to consume.
Yeah, it's, you know, and we are obsessed with measurement, right? And you feel culture before you measure it, and sometimes it's hard to articulate it because it's the very different part of your brain, right? And I see so many cultures that are measured with a set of values behind reception that don't reflect what's actually happening in terms of behavior. I would much rather take the opposite, where we feel it but actually struggle to convey it. And I think that's so key. And we all know when we've been in good and bad cultures, in good and bad moments. So I think, you know, what Steve said is so important. But just thinking about it intentionally. I think culture, like high performance, is a word that overwhelms people. Another one is innovation, right? They're words that get thrown around a lot, but can mean so many different things to others. I do know some companies that have stopped using the word culture because of the immediate connotation that delivers to the people in their organisation.
That's interesting. I'm gonna, since we're on to the big words now, I'm gonna throw out another controversial one here, if you're up for it. So, you know, we're talking about how we protect our well-being while we're striving for high performance, but how do we stay ambitious as teams and leaders without that tipping into burnout? That's my big word for today. I'm going to go straight to Simon. I'm sure you've got something interesting to say on this.
Right, the first thing I'm going to say, Kirsten, Samuel, the first thing I'm going to say is I think this word burnout is used a little bit too much. So if I think historically back 20 years ago, if you were burnt out, you were off work for between 3 and 6 months. You could hardly get out of bed. And now I go into places and I hear people having discussions about their levels of burnout over lunch. You know, my burnout at 11 was really pretty bad, but hopefully by 3 it should be good again. And who knows where tomorrow will take it. So what I find fascinating is this word burnout has morphed. And it's morphed into something that people don't really fully understand as a collective. And it reminds me of repetitive strain injury. I don't know if you can remember that from 25 years ago. I was a physio. I had people queuing out the door, right, close to Dean's office, actually, there. They probably, this was 25 years ago. We see the queue going by that bus just then. It was massive. And then all of a sudden we started to understand what repetitive strain injury was, and we educated people, and no one really had it anymore. And don't get me wrong, some people do get this in certain professions and certain jobs, but it wasn't the sort of epidemic levels that existed. And I think we need to take a similar approach to burnout. We've got to start educating people what burnout is and what it isn't. But burnout isn't a tough day, in my view.
And I'd add to that, I mentioned earlier, we look at something called the performance. Well, I'll start by saying, I think typically a lot of people are not and organisations are not as productive as they used to be. And I'll go on to say, statistically, as individuals, we have never had more time to ourselves than we have today. Right. I remember starting work in investment banking, and I had to be in the office at 7. I left the office at 6:30. I would not have seen my kids when they were young if I still continued to do that job, which I didn't, by the way, which was a choice. We have so much control over how we use our time, and yet our time seems so scarce. And I think that is a performance and productivity issue. I've been guilty in the past, and I've been fortunate enough. We didn't know we were on the same panel to begin with, but I've had the pleasure of Simon working with me a few years ago, which was brilliant, and I take some of that on. But you could look at my diary, and I was 8 hours back to back to back. And in a previous life of being a a professional football coach, you would never have trained a player for 8 hours. And in that 8 hours, there were key performance moments. So how do I really perform at a time when it matters most? And that's not by having 4 hours of back-to-back meetings before it. So really creating the focus again and clarity of what's important allows us to be able to organize ourselves so that we are ready in key moments. And that's what performance is. And sustainable performance is about low performance moments. Simon told me, he won't remember this, but 3 or 4 years ago when I worked with him, he said, Formula One races are won in the 10 seconds the car is stationary, right? When it's resting and recovering almost. And the same is true in business and sport and most facets of life. And that's what I think. It's not just doing more relentlessly, because we become very inefficient very, very quickly from a performance viewpoint. I've said a lot there, but I'll hand over to Steve. I know you'll build on that, I hope.
I think the point Simon raises is interesting. I think there's probably, and I think, yeah, any term can be overused. I think if I try and look at perhaps try and look at the positive in terms of the situation you described there, I think there is a point, like, is it that burnout was worse 30 years ago, or is it that people culturally suppressed any mention of it, so that actually by the time it got really bad, it was when people really needed to take 3 to 6 months off? So I think actually the fact that people and within a work environment feel it's okay to discuss it, I think actually, if it was go back to 30 years ago when you couldn't mention it until you fall off a cliff, and then it's a very dark path. Having a tough meeting and saying I think I was burnt out from it, that's probably an overuse and an oversimplification of the term. But I think more generally that people are becoming more self-aware that this is a risk. I think I like that. I think that's a good thing, that people are conscious that this is something that could happen to them. And then I think it very much feeds back into that level of prioritization. I think one of the things that I very much noticed is that I think, I talk about the priorities I've got, and I think very much, to Dean's sporting analogies, that you can't just, in a sports environment, you can't just continually train all the time and then expect to have a blistering game on a Saturday when your team's playing. The same is true in a work environment. I'd much rather people to work 40 hours in a week of high performance rather than 60 hours of probably low performance, which is impossible to keep the level up the whole time, and just sort of exist at a level of mediocrity. And I think part of what we can do to support people in that is to really help them prioritize. So a lot of the times I'll take a really basic exercise with people that I can tell are struggling with this and struggling with the conflict of, me and my team saying, we want to create balance, and they're just looking at their diary and thinking, this is just impossible. It's just far too much. And what I say to them is, if you look at everything that's in your diary over a week, there's always something that's more important than the next thing. So literally take every block from your diary, prioritize it, work out how many working hours you've got in the week, and then just draw a line, and don't do the stuff below the line. And it becomes quite a trust exercise that they kind of feel very uncomfortable, because they're kind of in a mindset where, unless you've done every single task that you saw, the world's probably going to end. But actually, by drawing that line, and then you sort of you try and tease them into like, just try it for 1 week, and then the next week try it for 1 more week, and all of a sudden they realise that the world hasn't ended. Actually, they've been much more performant in the things that stood above the line and met the grade. And I think enabling to help people with that prioritization, coupled with their ability to sort of be self-aware in terms of symptoms that could lead to burnout, I think is perhaps some of the best tools to help them avoid burning out. And then if they're aware of it themselves, hopefully they can pass on those techniques to others, but also be eyes and ears within a team looking around them. And it's not just they're spotting their own signs of potential stress and burnout, but looking around them and trying to spot the symptoms that could be existing within a team environment as well.
Yeah, and we try and use a bit of a methodology to help people with that. But what I would say is, I do think now we have more freedom with our time. It's not just about the work prioritization, it's the life prioritization. So I see a lot of kind of self-sabotage almost, and I've done it to myself, particularly since COVID, where we do have more choices in how we spend our time. And in our performance pie, which I stole gratefully from a performance agency called Planet K2, there's 6 segments that are kind of equal, but they change in terms of how you're doing. But half of the pie is about you, your physical, mental, and emotional performance, right? The other 3 parts are your technical, your skills, knowledge, tactical, how do you use those skills, and contextual, how do you apply them? But half of that pie is about you. And if you think about what we did during COVID, we were trying to outrunning and yoga and doing all these great things. We still have in flexible working in most places a lot more time to ourselves. But the way we spend that time and our screen hours and social media and all of the different things self-sabotage our performance recipe. So I think that equation of burnout is not just about the hours in work, it's your life as a whole now.
Yeah.
And can I just also add as well, I think it's also important to think, the word emotion has been mentioned a lot. I think this is a really important thing to consider, because we often think about the problems and we don't think of what emotions are being elicited in an individual by a specific problem. And those could be very, very different from person A to B. The problem could be exactly the same, but the emotional response could be very, very different. And I think trying to get to grips with some of those emotional responses, I call it the emotional multipliers, that occur with different stressors, I think is something else that's really key to preventing burnout or understanding what's causing people real challenges. And as Dean said, those challenges could be both at work and, often way more emotional factors away from work.
Definitely some more education required, I think, both at a kind of human level and a more organisational level. And I think that I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this. For me, the tension between performance and well-being, often comes down to leadership and the behaviours that can either stretch teams too far, or the behaviours that can help sustain them over the longer term. I'd be really interested to know what leadership behaviours you've seen that genuinely protect a team's long-term well-being and performance, whether that's from your own experience, your own leadership behaviours, or things that you've seen from other leaders in your organisation.
I'm happy to go first. We do a few things. The first thing is my current boss. I have to be careful what I say too publicly, but he's absolutely brilliant at this. I think one of the best skills a leader can have is the ability to make you feel confident, but challenge you almost in equal measure and know when you need each as an individual. I think you have to know people. I believe treating people fairly is different to treating them equally, because each person needs different things. Their performance recipe is different. And he has a brilliant balance. And I remember I was going through some really, really tough stuff in my life, in multiple areas, in my personal life. And they were quite severe things. And I remember him saying to me, just focus on you, get out of work, because we need you to deal with that. Because when you come back, you will be a better executive. Mm-hmm. And I was, because you realise work is work, and I love what I do. I'm passionate about it. It's part of my purpose and my life, because I believe that's the healthy thing to do. We can all choose how we spend our time. We live in countries where we have choices. We don't have to do the job that we do, and finding something you love is important. But you realise as well that it is work, and the sun will come up in the morning, and it will be okay when you go through some tough times in your life. So, really framing things like that. And I was better for it as a person and an individual, because I was allowed to process that. I think that that's hugely important. And the other thing is this kind of misnomer is well-being and performance aren't opposites. They're actually related, right? The better you are and the more well you are as an individual, the better you will perform at work. And when that performance recipe is good, you will get some consistency too in your wellness, which is quite hard. You could be traveling around the world and your life is changing. They're not different things. Done right, they are absolutely the same, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dean. I think what you said also really echoes that time that you took away from work, took out of work, really echoes what Steve was saying earlier around the priorities of health, family and work. And actually you get the first two right in equal measures, then you can just give everything to the work.
Yeah. And to most of our listeners, it probably sounded very simple when Steve said it, but for a leader to give his team permission continuously to do that is the most important thing, and that's rare.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I'd add to that, Dean, is I think back to your question on this, guys. I think it's I think when I look at leadership traits, I think probably the number one thing, and it's something I try and do, and it's something I massively respect in leaders I work for, is consistency. I think if people, one of the easy ways to reduce strain and stress in a work environment is for people to understand that the teams around them and their leaders will be consistent in terms of how they turn up. And if people are consistent in terms of their messaging, their expectations, who shows up every day, I think that's really grounding for any team. And I think it's, from a human nature point of view, that's the people I love working for. And yeah, I'm lucky to work for amazing leaders that display those traits. And it's something which I found, if I can, I know I'm a sort of an enthusiastic recipient of that style of leadership. So it's something which I try and actively offer to my teams, because I know how much of a difference it makes to my personal motivation if I've got that level of consistency and approach and messaging, rather than sort of treading on eggshells, wondering how you need to position something. It's exhausting if you're constantly trying to balance how you're going to approach something. And I think if we can offer that to teams, that's an easy win, and often the most impactful things, I think, with any team scenario, are often the simplest. And if you can do those things well and consistently, I think you're onto a good metric.
I know Simon will have something to add here, but just to add to that, I didn't know we'd go here, but we've spoken about organizational culture and behaviors and values. But to Steve's point, I think most of us, whether you're a leader or not, individually or collectively, and we're all kind of leaders, is we spend our life working about where we're going. But before you actually go on the journey, you need to do the work to know who you are and what your own personal values are. And when you can get that grounding of who you actually are, it allows you to manage your life so much better. And I feel that particularly in the workplace, we're so what's next? What are we going to achieve? What's our target? What position am I going to be in? Where am I going to go? But knowing who you are and your performance recipe. And I often say to people, when you're at your best, what's happened? How did you prepare? What environment are you in? Who are you with? What have you consumed? What have you eaten? Where actually are you? And knowing that as the basis of your own individual performance is so important to move forward.
There was it just reminds me, you mentioned that there was a long while ago, and again, this is you're gonna start to hear the rhetoric that I come out with to my teams. So when I was on a course at Berkeley, one of the things they talked about in terms of high impact leadership was around they got everyone to take a big A2 sheet of paper, and you had to draw this river of life. You could start whatever you wanted, as a child, in your working life, whatever. And on the top riverbank, you wrote down everything professionally that had gone on in your professional life. And then on the other riverbank, you had to write down in the same kind of time zone what was going on personally, and what was kind of happening in your personal life, and other things that influenced it. And all of a sudden, we all, and again, everybody in the room, 40 people in the room, were having the same realizations, that there was a sort of, over 20 years or whatever, there was repeatable things, that when there were peaks of really high performance, when you got the job you wanted, you did the deal you wanted to do, something really great at work, coincided with particular things that were happening in your home life and your personal life, and the two things were interrelated. And when things were kind of most chaotic at home, there was this dip in work, and it was kind of, everybody found this in any industry in multiple different countries. This was mapped in the same way, and it was, again, such a simple exercise, but really quite, it was an eye opener to everyone. And it was, you could see the people running it, that they'd done this so many times, and they just knew this worked every time for every industry. And it was, everyone had this sort of like light bulb moment where the light bulb came above their head, and it was like, oh wow, it's not just, these things aren't unrelated. It's
So let's have a think about now, about sometimes things just don't go to plan for whatever reason. And even the best teams will hit bumps in the road at some point. Simon, in your experience, what are some of the more subtle signs that a team's performance is becoming unsustainable that might be easy to miss unless you're really tuned in?
People leaving is not a particularly subtle sign, but it's probably one of the interesting ones. And often there's some more subtle ones that happen before that, which will be they start moaning, or they become critical, or they change either in their appearance or their timekeeping, or you hear gossip that they're looking for another job, or that they're disappearing at 11 o'clock, which is always a classic time to go and meet a headhunter, or those sorts of things. So I think that's sort of the typical things one looks for is, are we changing? And of course, if you haven't established what we are, I love Dean's comment about, good leaders make sure we learn from the good. So if you've had this most incredible time, document it down, because you might have the blueprint for success sitting right in front of you and is your reference point when you do hit those road bumps and those blocks that you've just mentioned. So creating those reference points around the good. You're going to go back to sport. The number of hours I have spent in a dressing room dissecting a poor performance is unbelievable. The number of microseconds I've spent assessing a great performance, I could probably count on one hand before we go to the pub. It's really interesting, isn't it? What we do analysing the not good, and how oblivious we are to the great things. So I think create the reference point then allows you to understand when things are changing, because change is probably the biggest indicator that things are not quite right.
To add to that, a few months ago, I had the pleasure of spending some time with Brené Brown, the business coach in the States, who was excellent. And she spoke a bit about psychological safety. She said, kind of looked you in the eye and said, I'm not going to ask you to be vulnerable. I'm going to tell you you will be. You've been vulnerable in the last 12 months. You'll be vulnerable in the next 12 months, and that's okay. The key is to understand your default behavior when you become vulnerable. And so for me, some of the signs are when people change behavior. So for example, when people are vulnerable, a lot of very curious learners become knowers and overtalk and tell. And you'll see people, I call it reacting rather than responding. And I think the subtle signs are the things that really begin to come first.
That's so interesting. So there's the more obvious ones, but if you actually really tune in and you know that person really well, there are some of those subtle indicators quite early on.
Yeah, because the key is, how do you catch it before it goes too far? As a young leader, I remember the biggest mistake I made, and I talk about this a lot, is I was so into the P&L and the strategy and what we were doing. The best thing you can do as a leader is know what your team are thinking when their head hits the pillow every night and they assess their day. It's the most powerful thing you've got as a leader. It's not the strategy in the PowerPoint or what the Excel spreadsheet is going to say at the end of the month. It's how are the people that are in your team feeling, and how are you tracking?
One of the things that I always say to my team, a bit like Steve says to his team, is, whatever matters to you matters to me, and really making that intentional effort to find out what's going on really can make the difference. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because spotting the signs is one thing, creating the systems to catch them early on is an entirely different thing, and creating those kind of feedback loops and things like that.
Yeah. Well, Steve mentioned it earlier. I do think this is really important in a world that's so fast-paced now, and our world is fast-paced. It will be fast-paced forevermore. Is the concept of feed forward rather than feedback. So what are the early indicators you can get before it's happened? It's a bit like, Simon's worked with a lot of professional cricket teams, but it's pointless telling someone what they did wrong when the bat's under their arm in cricket and they're out, right? You need to give them the information while they're walking into bat, not after the event is done and they're looking at the scoreboard and they can do nothing about it. And so those leading indicators and that leading coaching becomes absolutely critical.
Can I just add there as well? I think the other thing to add into that is this concept of what I call adaptive intelligence. We talk about IQ, we talk about EQ, and I think great leaders and great teams are the ones that can adapt to a particular moment in time. as Dean said, the world is changing at this incredible pace, and that cricketer who went out to bat with some form of instruction might have to adapt based on what the opposition does to you, because they've got instructions as well. So creating a culture where, you know, adaptive intelligence is encouraged, I think is a useful thing to think about too.
Agreed, and that comes from empowerment rather than making decisions, right? And I think Craig Samuels put a good question in around how you leverage AI to support that, right? AI can often see the patterns before the individual themselves. So things like wearable devices, all of those sorts of things make a massive impact to that feed forward moment.
No, just in avid agreement with you both.
I mean, let's stay on the subject of AI. Obviously, you know, looking ahead, we are in the world of hybrid work. We've got AI. We touched on the really massive evolving employee expectations. What do we think high performance might look like 5 years from now?
I think certainly from my perspective, I think we're at kind of I mean, we just touched in the last question around the pace of change is ever increasing. So I think, you know, to Simon's point, the ability to make workforces resilient to deal with change has never been more relevant. And I think that, you know, over the course of the last 12 months, you know, the pace of change around artificial intelligence is moving way quicker than there's always moments in technology. I've worked in technology for 25 years, and I always think kind of it can't get faster than this. And there's been a few things that have hit in that 25-year career that have been like, wow, I knew nothing yesterday because this is fast now. And I think in terms of the last 12 months, that the speed at which AI has really developed and moved to being something that's really clicked in terms of business value. And I think certainly when I see across agentic workforces and that whole digital labor revolution, I think I see that as something which is probably highly complementary to working with high performance teams and actually increasing levels of well-being for physical workforce teams. Because when we look at any business and you look at, you know, pinch points in terms of high demands on employees, which can then lead to high degrees of stress, can lead to burnout, can lead to staff attrition. They often come from things that are unplanned within a work environment, outside influences that have created some level of chaos within a business, the inability to scale a physical workforce overnight by 20%, and suddenly that demand is placed upon the existing workforce, suddenly meaning everyone needs to output 20% more, which in a traditional workforce can only come from just doing more hours. And you know, in any business, you can see those kind of trends happening. Something happens, there's a panic, there's something happens, and suddenly there's just everyone needs to all hands to the pump, and that creates strain. That affects people's balance, it affects well-being. But I think as we start to consider the evolution of physical and digital workforces working alongside within the same teams, actually being able to kind of have burst capacity within an agentic workforce, that's something which can be done that won't cause strain or pressure for the physical workers. So I think actually it's a good opportunity to see the development of technology in a very positive way to help protect our physical workforce, the people that have got amazing IP built up over many years, and actually ensure they're doing the roles that best place the skill set they have.
I'm happy to add, but I know Simon's an expert because he's worked with me in this area of technology. So I don't know if you want to go first, Simon, but I've got.
I find it quite interesting because I'm not really a technologist, but I have used technology for over 20 years to sort of measure and provide objective data around what I would call the human and the humane side of performance, and use it to tell stories, to open things up. But I think technology is going to put another layer of understanding into things. I think technology is going to help make better decisions more consistently. I think technology is going to be a catalyst for fear amongst a number of people. Again, it goes back to, if we don't know about something but everyone's talking about it, we become a bit more fearful. So I think the successful organizations when it comes to technology and AI are going to be the ones who invest in education who invest in the positioning to make sure that it isn't just in the remit of of those at the very top table, that everyone in the organization knows how it fits in and how it can benefit, and we manage anxiety that any form of change, or as I like to call it, progress, can sometimes trigger.
And I'd add, we use a phrase a lot here. So we're quite a big, we're data and a technology business. So AI is big for us, around Jevons paradox. I don't know if anyone has heard of that, but it's around in the late 1800s, where everyone was up in arms because of the invention of the coal engine, because they thought, oh my God, it's going to burn coal so efficiently, it's going to put us all out of jobs. And as it happened, it was such a great piece of engineering. The demand for coal went up exponentially, but the initial thing was, this is bad for the industry. And AI really can do the things that we don't like doing to make us more productive and put ourselves in the place of most potential. But I guess the thing I always say is, whilst machines are getting better at being machines, humans need to get better at being human. And that's the key.
Finding a way to coexist.
Last thing there, Kirsten, it's just on pace, if that's all right. I think pace is really important, and a leader's role for the teams moving forward is that everyone's moving at a similar pace. I often use the analogy of the conductor in the orchestra, and if the second trombones are playing 2 bars ahead of the first violins, it ain't a beautiful noise. You need teams working at a similar pace, both internally and potentially with your clients. Let's understand what pace we're going to work at here.
Yeah.
It's a good conversation to have.
That's a great conversation, a great analogy that I'm going to definitely pinch.
All the right notes and the right order, isn't it?
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like this should have been a 2-part. This needs to be a 2-part series. We've covered so much ground today, from what is redefining what high performance looks like, what are the cues, the signs of unsustainable pressure, to what it means to lead resilient and I guess future focused prepared teams. I guess just for the last couple of minutes, to all three of you, if you could give one piece of advice to leaders who want to future-proof their teams, what would it be?
All right, I'm happy to go first, if that's all right. Because someone else might nick what I was going to say. I've always learned this getting quick.
Here, isn't there?
Every single day, write down, what have I learned today? That's my bit of advice, because you will have the most incredible learning log and a record of a journey that you go on. And some of that learning will be deliberate, but most of it won't. And it just has to be a word or a sentence. What have I learned today? Because we talk about a learning culture. Sometimes you've got to be the first person who starts to do it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Steve?
I think final thought is that there's a phrase that one of my leaders uses, which I absolutely love, and there's always the big aims we have, whether it's something monthly, quarterly, in the fiscal year. But I think the way she sees satisfaction with her teams and motivates them is just to say, just every day, end of the day, feeling you're at least one step forward than you were at the start of the day. And I think that's a really good mindset, a very positive mindset, and it's something where you can give yourself permission to celebrate the small wins. And actually, if you're a step forward, it's great. You might be 20 steps forward. As long as you're one step, actually take a pause, give yourself a pat on the back, and that's a good day. It's not just waiting until you've reached the crescendo of something that's taken you 3 months to deliver. Take the 92 days on the journey to that end of quarter and pat yourself on the back 92 times rather than once at the end of the journey.
Thank you. And Dean?
Mine is just try and do all you can to be better today than you were yesterday, and that shouldn't be a pressure. What's beautiful about that is you're in control of it, because you've got your own definition of what high performance is, and there's a sense of beautiful fulfillment in a world of chaos that comes with knowing that you can control that yourself, and that empowerment and control in a world that we can't predict becomes quite powerful and, most importantly, fulfilling for every individual, is my view.
Fantastic. What a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Dean, Steve, Simon, and thank you to everyone who has joined us live or is going to be watching this back. If you found today valuable, please feel free to continue the conversation over on LinkedIn, and we'll see you next time on Beyond Wellbeing Live. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.